We're looking at how to define a composite key class. We're continuing our videos for database integration, modeling data using JPA and Hyperdate. The rest of these videos can be found in the playlist linked below the like button. But for defining a composite key class, in a lot of cases, we will want to have more than one key. This is where we deal with composite keys. If we configure it correctly, the JPA will take care of a lot of the work. So continuing this off, we're going to go into our com.skillsoft.jpa package, and we're going to want to create a new employee entry ID. So this is our class name. Inside of here, we want to record the local date that an employee clocks in. And for this, we're going to make a new table. Since multiple employees can clock in on a certain day, that's not unique. However, the combination of these two, since an employee can only clock in once per day, is unique. So this class right here, our employee entry ID, is going to represent the keys for this. It's going to be an embedded one. We can start this by saying @embeddable. And since it's @embeddable, this is going to be embedded into another class. We just have our private int employee ID, private local date. We have a default and a parameterized constructor. We have getters and setters. And then we have this override method. And this override is going to see if they are the same. So if this is equal to our object, and this object is like another employee entry that's passed in, if they're equal, return true. If our object is not an instance of this, we're returning false. And then we're going to want to store this. We're going to cast our object as an employee entry ID. And then we're going to do one last check here and return true if it's true and false if it's not. And then we just are overriding our hash code. We're hashing our employee ID and the local date together. So now that this is embedded, we can embed it into our other class. However, lastly, the entity is going to implement the serializable interface. So now we want to make our employee entry.java. So we want to make a class to implement our previous one. Notice how in the previous one, look at this, we have this entity right here. In the previous one though, we look back, we don't have an entity included. That's because it's not, and it's only embedded in our employee entry. The embeddable means the entity will have composite fields, which will need to be embedded. We know that employee ID and date are embedded within the first variable. So our employee ID, so @embedded ID, this is a notation. Inside of here, this single part is going to hold this entire class right here, this entire entity. So it's going to hold the entire previous one. We have to change our auto-generated constructor right here. Instead of having it as employee entry ID, we are going to want the emp ID and local date passed in so that we can fill in these variables. That's important to have right there. And so when we have this employee entry ID, we're going to pass in both of these right here. After our getters and setters, we're going to override just to print this out. This is the basic one, and then we're overriding it to, we can see, include the employee ID, where we get it from, and then we also get the local date. So from the employee entry ID, we're going to get the employee ID, and we're also going to get the local date. And that's going to be it for defining a composite key class and setting it up. Next, we're going to implement our composite keys. So there is an error here that I need to address, and it's very, very important that we address this. It's in our employee entry ID and in our employee entry.java. Now in IntelliJ, when you make like this local time here, we'll do local time, and we want to give a name for it, it's going to say local time like this. And if we have this, we're going to get an error in our SQL code, and that's because MySQL is not case sensitive. So if we have uppercase lower time, and then we have lowercase local time, it's going to throw us an error because it just can't do that. Now, we need to go in and rename everything. So this is going to be in our employee entity ID.java class. So this is here. We're going to want to change this local date to entry date. Same thing with here. Same thing with here. This get entry date, returning entry date, this entry date, and then I believe a little bit inside of here as well, and then inside of our hash code. Now we have our employee entry, so we're going to want to change our entry time. We're going to do this here, 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 and then some more down here, maybe a little bit in here. That's the first thing that we need to change to actually fix this. Now let's go into our app.java. We need to add in our local date and time because we're going to be setting these for our employees through these imports right here. Now let's go through our code. This is going to be pretty much the same as the last time. We're going to be using our persistence XML file that we've created over here. Back in our app, we are going to have this entity manager as the factory.createEntityManager. And then we're going to begin our transaction. we are going to enter one employee, another employee. Well, this is technically the same employee, right? Just in a different day. We have a third employee, and this is really a second employee though. Then we're going to have saving down entry, and these are just printing out to our console just to see and confirm that we did this correctly. And then we're going to persist these. This is basically like a save. And then the rest of this is the same. So let's try running this now. We can see that we get these Hibernate notes. We can see that the Hibernate has dropped the table if it exists, dropped the table of the employee if it exists. This department, we're not going to be using it. We just have this .java file that we used previously. And the same thing for our employee entry and then our Hibernate sequence. And then we're going to be creating all of these tables here. These are the creation of the tables in the Hibernate sequence. After this, we have our insertions right here. So we can see that we have 3, 1, 2, and 3. These are for the 3 different employees. If we go into our MySQL, if we run our show create tables, it's going to give us information about our tables. Now let's run our select star from employee entry. We run this, we can see that we have our employee IDs, the employee date, and the entry time. And this is using our composite keys. Now another way we can go about doing our embedded, because we have this embeddable right here, is removing it from here and doing it in our employee entry. So what we're going to want to do, first thing, is that we can remove our annotations from here. We can comment this import out, and we can comment out this embeddable. So with these commented out, we don't have to change anything else. We'll go into our employee entry.java. And then inside of here, we're also not going to need our embedded ID or the entity right here. Actually, we're going to need our embedded ID. We're not going to use our persistence though, the persistence.entity. So let's bring all of this back. We're going to want to comment out entity and then our @entity. So we've commented these out. We're not using them here. And then we're also going to want to get rid of this @embedded ID right here. So we can take this out as well. Let's comment this out so we can just keep it inside of here. Let's comment that, comment that, comment that. And inside of here, we're not going to have our employee entry ID either. What we're going to want is each of these fields. So we can go inside of here, and we're going to have a private, and we're going to have ints, and then we're going to have our employee ID. And then we're also going to have a private int local date, and then we're going to call this entry date, and then we're going to end this. Now on top of each of these, we're going to make these IDs. So we're going to do @ID here, we're going to do @ID here, and then this should also, we should have fixed this last time, but this should be private as well. Now we're going to want to change this constructor. So instead of having this, we're going to do a this dot, we have our employee ID, and we'll set it equal to our emp ID, and then we are also going to have our this dot, and then we have our entry date, and then we're going to set it equal to, well, first let's actually spell it correctly. So entry date is set equal to our, and this is local date, but let's change that to entry date as well. Let's copy this in, paste it here, and so we're just changing our constructor. Now another thing that we're going to want to do is remove these getters and setters. We don't need them anymore. We're going to keep our get entry time and our set entry time right here. And we are going to want to make constructors for our other variables. So we'll go here, we'll go to generate, we will go into, not constructors, sorry, I think I said constructors, I think I mean getters and setters. We're going to want the employee ID and the get local date. So we have getters and setters for each of these. Now we also have to modify this toString right here. So instead of doing the employee plus get ID, all we need to do is the get employee ID, and then we're going to get our employee date. So we can get rid of these. We're going to get our ID and our date right here. One last thing that we have to do after we do all this is modify this class. So I commented out the fact that it's an entity, and this should not be commented out because it is still an entity. We only wanted to comment out the embedded part. That was my mistake. So if we have an entity, we never want to comment that out, because if it's an entity, well, that's the only way it gets accessed by our application right here. So make sure that these are entities, and then we also need a @ID class. This is important if we're going to do our annotations like this, because inside of these parameters, or this parentheses for our ID class, we're going to pass in our employee, and then we're going to have our entry ID. And the reason why we need to pass in the whole class, so we're going to do the dot class, is because we need to get everything inside of here so that we can use it inside of here. I noticed that when I was running it, I got a error. So let's rerun it again, hopefully clean this time. See, we get those nodes, and this looks exactly like the last one where we have our drops, we have our creates, we can see that we have our employee entry appearing, and then we have our inserts right here. So if we go back into our MySQL workbench and we run this again, we can see it does the exact same thing. So that's just another way to implement composite keys. And that's it for this video on defining a composite key class and then implementing composite keys.